They sold you a fairy tale. But what if that $32 million royal wedding was never a love story at all? What if it was a perfectly staged takeover, hiding something far colder beneath the lace and diamonds? Because long before the world watched that carriage roll through Windsor, before the veil floated and the cameras flashed, there were whispers, quiet, uncomfortable whispers that something wasn't adding up. And now those whispers are turning into something louder, sharper, almost impossible to ignore. This isn't just gossip anymore. It's a pattern, a trail, a sequence of moments that, when stitched together, paint a picture far more calculated than anyone dared admit. Look closer, not at the wedding itself, but at what led to it. The narrative we were fed was simple. An American outsider, innocent, unaware, swept into royalty. But behind that story, another version begins to surface. A version where nothing was accidental. A version where every move, every word, every carefully timed appearance was part of something far more deliberate. Because according to emerging accounts, this wasn't an encounter, it was a mission, a pursuit. A strategy that allegedly began years before the world even knew her name in royal circles. And then comes the detail that feels almost too symbolic to be coincidence. The car. That Rolls-Royce Phantom IV. Not just any royal vehicle, no. One tied to a woman whose presence once shook the monarchy to its core. Why that car? Why that exact message on that exact day? Was it just preference? Or was it something else entirely? Because insiders didn't see it as random, they saw it as a signal. A quiet declaration that history might be repeating itself, but with a modern twist. And if that wasn't enough, the tension didn't stay hidden behind palace walls. It leaked in strange, uncomfortable ways, like the moment when a centuries-old chapel, one of the most sacred and historic spaces in Britain, was reportedly dismissed as musty. Think about that. Not just a complaint, but a demand to change it, to alter it, to spray over history itself. That's not nerves, that's not stress, that's control. And when that demand was refused, what followed wasn't quiet disappointment, it was an eruption that left staff shaken and questioning everything. Then there's the walk, that aisle moment everyone praised as powerful, independent, iconic. But slow it down, watch closely. There's a split second barely noticeable where assistance is brushed aside, a guiding hand rejected, because the camera had to see one thing and one thing only. Not a bride being guided, but a figure commanding the scene. Even the future king stepping in halfway begins to feel less like support and more like staging, a prop in a perfectly controlled narrative. And suddenly, the contradictions start piling up. The claim about not knowing anything about the royal family, not even Googling him. It sounded humble, almost naive. But now, voices from inside elite circles are pushing back, suggesting something completely different, a deep awareness, a fascination, even a long-standing interest in the very world she claimed was foreign to her. So which version is real? The wide-eyed outsider or the woman who already knew exactly where she was stepping? And then comes the moment that cracked everything open, the secret wedding claim. A private ceremony, 3 days before the spectacle. It sounded romantic, intimate, almost rebellious, until it didn't hold up, until it was corrected, publicly, officially. And just like that, what was meant to feel authentic started to feel manufactured. Why say it at all if it could be disproven so easily? Unless the story itself mattered more than the truth behind it. But maybe the most unsettling part isn't any single incident. It's the pattern between them. The way small moments, each one explainable on its own, start to connect. The car, the chapel, the walk, the claims, the conflicts. Each one a thread. And when you pull them together, they don't unravel, they tighten. Because behind the glamour, behind the headlines, behind the carefully curated image, there's a question that refuses to go away. Was this ever just a wedding? Or was it something much bigger? Something designed, controlled, and executed with precision from the very beginning? And if that's true, then what else haven't we seen yet? And just when you think the story couldn't twist any further, it does. Because the wedding wasn't the climax, it was the beginning of something far more unsettling. Something that only becomes visible when you follow what happened after the applause faded and the cameras stopped rolling. Because this is where the cracks don't just show, they widen. They echo. They start telling their own story. Take the inner circle, the friends, the allies, the people who were supposed to anchor everything. There is that infamous shooting weekend, an introduction meant to bring two worlds together. Instead, it became a fracture point. What was expected to be laughter and bonding reportedly turned into interrogation and tension, where jokes weren't just jokes anymore, where conversations turned into confrontations, and where long-standing friendships began to feel like liabilities overnight. And here's the part that lingers. Those friends didn't just feel uncomfortable, they walked away way convinced something wasn't right. And yet, instead of slowing down, instead of questioning, the distance only grew. Not naturally, but sharply, deliberately, as if those connections had to be cut for something else to take their place. Then comes the family layer, and this is where it gets even colder. The narrative painted for the world was clean, almost cinematic, a difficult father, unfortunate circumstances, unavoidable distance. But behind that, another explanation starts surfacing, one that feels less accidental and more strategic. Because when a father becomes inconvenient to an image, when imperfections don't align with a carefully curated brand, what happens next? According to the emerging accounts, reconciliation wasn't just avoided, it was refused, even when urged at the highest level. Think about that moment. A plea made, a chance to fix everything quietly, and a firm no. Not hesitation, not confusion, a decision. Because sometimes absence tells a stronger story than presence ever could. And then the bridesmaid incident, the one that split public opinion right down the middle. Two versions, two completely different emotional truths. One says tears were caused, the other says tears were inflicted. But here's what makes this moment so explosive: only one side could speak. The other was bound by silence, by tradition, by rules that don't allow defense. So the narrative that reached the world wasn't just a version, it was the only version allowed to exist publicly. And when you realize that, the entire situation starts to feel less like a misunderstanding and more like a perfectly placed move in a much larger game. But the most dangerous thread in all of this isn't about dresses or dinners or awkward weekends, it's psychological. It's the idea that one story was used to activate another, because there are claims, deeply unsettling claims, that a very specific emotional trigger was repeatedly touched, repeatedly reinforced. The memory of Diana, the trauma, the fear of history repeating itself. And when you connect that to the constant framing of victimhood, of persecution, of being hunted, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like influence, like a narrative designed not just for the public, but for one person in particular. And once that bond was locked in, everything else began to orbit around it. And then we arrive at the aftermath, the part no one expected to look like this. Because the grand exit, the promise of independence, the vision of global dominance, it all sounded unstoppable at first. Deals were signed, headlines exploded, a new empire was supposed to rise. But fast forward and the shine starts fading. Projects stall, expectations collapse, and whispers begin circulating again, but this time not about the past, about the present, about reliability, about delivery, about whether the story that built everything can actually sustain anything beyond itself. And this is where it turns almost eerie, because while one side grows quieter, more distant, more insulated, the other side, the one left behind, becomes stronger without saying a word. No reactions, no public battles, just silence. And that silence starts doing something unexpected. It amplifies everything. Because when one side keeps talking and the other refuses to respond, the contrast becomes deafening. It creates a vacuum where doubt grows, where every new claim is met not with confrontation, but with absence. And absence in a story like this is terrifyingly powerful. Now layer in the financial pressure, the shifting alliances, the disappearing support. The same circles that once leaned in are now stepping back quietly, carefully, almost as if they don't want to be caught in the fallout. Because credibility, once questioned, doesn't just crack, it spreads. It affects everything, every deal, every partnership, every future move. And suddenly, the narrative that once opened doors begins to close them instead. And then there's the theory, the one that feels almost too sharp, too ruthless to ignore. The idea that loyalty isn't emotional, it's functional. That relationships evolve based on usefulness, not attachment. And when you trace the timeline, past connections, past exits, past reinventions, it starts forming a pattern that's hard to unsee. Because if every phase ends the same way, if every chapter closes once its purpose is fulfilled, then what happens when the current chapter reaches its limit? That's the question hanging in the air right now. Because as everything tightens, the scrutiny, the exposure, the silence from one side and the noise from the other, there's a growing sense that something is about to shift again. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, strategically, the way it always seems to happen in this story. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Not what we've seen, but what we haven't. Not the revelations already out there, but the ones still sitting, waiting, in documents, in memories, in places that haven't spoken yet. Because if this entire story has been about control, about narrative, about perception, about timing, then the real question isn't what happened in the past. It's what's about to happen next, and who will still be standing when the story finally runs out of versions. Finally runs out of versions. Finally runs out of versions.